It was meant to be the airplane that would change everything, a machine born not for war but for vanity. It was built to amaze the planet, to carry the Olympic flame halfway across the world and prove nothing is impossible for Germany. But this aircraft, named after Hitler himself, became a curse for its creators. Its takeoffs are shrouded in secrecy, its disappearance a mystery. It survived wars, prohibitions, and even the dictator himself, remaining a symbol of a country that believed too much in its own greatness. Why was its record never officially recognized? And why did its name vanish from all archives? This video tells the story of the machine that became a mirror of an era, where propaganda soared above the clouds and crashed along with the country that birthed it. Berlin was slowly transforming into the showcase of a new world, a world where everything was subservient to a single design, to prove that Germany was great again. The city shone like a stage set. Eagles, banners, and drums were on every corner. But behind this perfectly curated image lay an uneasy silence. Everything created had to serve one image: the myth of a nation supposedly reborn from chaos, now bringing order and strength to the world. Sport became a weapon in the hands of propaganda, and the Olympics its main projectile. For millions, it looked like a celebration. But for those behind the scenes, everything was meticulously planned. Cameras captured smiling spectators. Commentators praised German organization. Foreign journalists admired the architecture and scale. Everything that could incite doubt was hidden behind the facades. Even the politics of hatred were temporarily muted, so that guests would leave with the impression that Germany had become the center of the civilized world. The new regime understood that nothing worked better for their image than spectacle, and the grander it was, the longer its echo would sound. The Olympics became the mirror in which Germany wanted to see not itself, but the ideal illusion it was building for the world. But the ambitions weren't limited to arenas and medals. On the ground, Germany had already proven its discipline. Now, this feeling of superiority needed to be raised into the sky. The idea emerged to use aviation, a symbol of progress, courage, and technical prowess. Aircraft weren't just transport. They were the embodiment of the ideal of a new age. The plane could become not a weapon, but a flag flying above all nations. Hidden within this idea was a challenge, to prove that the Germans were capable not just of building stadiums, but also of creating technological wonders that would stun the world. Engineers and officials realized that one impressive achievement in the sky could replace hundreds of speeches. If a German aircraft set a record, achieved the impossible, it would become not just a technological event, but a powerful symbol. The people would see it as a triumph of spirit, and the world as proof of German superiority. Thus, in an atmosphere of parades, anthems, and the rhythmic march of athletes, the idea was born that was intended to turn propaganda into flight. It started with a question: what if the next Olympic flame flew across the sky without touching the earth? What if Germany became the first country capable of connecting two continents with one continuous flight? Upon this question, they built a dream, and upon the dream, a project destined to become a legend. Ahead were calculations, blueprints, arguments, and sleepless nights for the engineers. But everything began right here, in Berlin, where, to the music of fanfares, the plan to conquer the sky was born so that the world would see how strong a country appears when viewed from the ground. And while the last fans dispersed into the streets where the searchlights faded and the flags dropped, in the offices, they were already discussing not sporting records, but how to make the German flag fly over the whole world, in the literal sense of the word. The regime, obsessed with greatness, tolerated no limitations. After the Berlin triumph of 1936, Germany decided the next step had to be even grander, louder, crazier. The 1940 Olympic Games were scheduled to take place in Japan, a country that, like Germany, was trying to convince the world that its path was justified. Both powers sought a way to appear more civilized, progressive, and humane than they were perceived abroad. The world had already seen the destroyed cities of China and heard stories of concentration camps. Something was needed that could drown out the fear and distrust. A common word was born in both Japanese and German propaganda: miracle. The miracle was meant to convince people that these countries had not only guns and tanks, but something higher, a spirit of invention. a striving for peace and progress. But while Japan planned to impress with organization, Germany decided to strike at the very sky. The idea looked like a madman's fantasy. The Olympic flame, ignited in Greece, was to reach Tokyo not by land or sea, but through the air, in one continuous direct flight from Berlin to Japan. This was not just a technical concept, it was a planetary spectacle. The fiery symbol of peace was supposed to cross half the globe aboard a German aircraft, becoming a living metaphor. Germany is the light that connects continents. The problem was singular. No existing aircraft could make such a flight. There was no engine, fuel, or aerodynamics to cover over 5,000 miles without landing. But it was precisely the impossibility that made the project tempting. For the Nazi leadership, impossible was just a word used by the weak. And now, engineers faced a task that merged politics, propaganda, and engineering fanaticism. To build a plane that could achieve the impossible for an idea. Meetings were held in ministries where officials discussed not records, but symbols. This flight was meant to be a new page in German history, proof that the country could overtake the entire world. If successful, millions would see Germany not as an aggressor, but as a leader of humanity. And though all of it was a lie wrapped in metal, kerosene, and patriotism. When the project was approved, everything seemed settled. Japan had the role of the host, and Germany, the glory of the country that would deliver the Olympic flame across the heavens. Two powers, linked by war and ambition, found common ground in a symbol meant to unite the planet. And at that moment, no one noticed that beneath the slogans of peace and sport, they were slowly creating not just an aircraft, but a new tool for influencing consciousness. Thus, in laboratories and workshops, an idea was conceived that reeked of both madness and genius. It couldn't be explained rationally, but it could be sold as a dream. The world had to believe that Germany could carry the light, even if that light burned from kerosene. And somewhere on the drawing boards, the first outlines of the machine that was to connect Berlin and Tokyo with one continuous engine breath began to appear. It all started with blueprints that kept engineers from sleeping. In Munich, within the walls of the Messerschmitt Bureau, where the smell of machine oil mixed with tobacco smoke and tension, the airplane was being born that would prove German technology knows no boundaries. The project's basis seemed familiar. The heavy fighter Bf-110, which had already proven its reliability and power. But now, that wasn't enough. The machine wasn't supposed to fight, but to impress. Not to win, but to dazzle. Every element was reevaluated. Weight was the enemy, range the god. Any detail not related to fuel was considered superfluous. Guns, machine guns, even bomb racks, all were discarded. In their place came tanks, endless tanks, integrated even into the wings. Metal became a vessel for kerosene, the plane a living reservoir of energy. Now, every drop of fuel meant another minute in the sky, another kilometer closer to the record. The engineers working on the project felt they were building not just a machine, but a symbol of the era. They were allowed everything except one thing: failure. The designers increased the wingspan to almost 27 meters. The fuselage was stretched to 16.5 meters to accommodate 5 crew members and navigation equipment. Even inside, the plane looked like a laboratory, cramped but meticulously planned. The pilot and co-pilot sat side by side, behind them the radio operator, further back the navigator and the mechanic, and between them, a narrow space for rest. After all, the flight for which this machine was being born was meant to last for over 24 hours, but the main heart of the Adolphine was its engines. A typical aircraft had 2. This one had 4, but paired together. On each wing was one power unit consisting of 2 Daimler-Benz engines connected into a single block. This insane scheme allowed for nearly 5,500 horsepower, more than some bombers. The propellers spun like giant ship screws, promising not speed, but endurance, not a burst, but eternity. The shape of the plane resembled its predecessor, but the scale was astonishing. It was longer, wider, heavier, as if the shadow of the Bf-110 had grown to the size of a giant. Every line of the fuselage screamed its intent: fly farther than anyone, even if it means sacrificing everything else. This wasn't just engineering, it was a cult of range turned into metal. When Hitler learned about the project, He was intrigued not by the details or the engines. He liked the idea itself. An aircraft built for a record perfectly fit his conception of national greatness. A machine capable of crossing the planet. That was the ideal symbol of a nation destined to dominate the sky. Thus, by order from above, the project received the unofficial name Adolphine. No one dared to object, though among the engineers, the nickname was spoken with slight irony. It reflected the essence of the plane, powerful, ambitious, but created more for show than for substance. By the end of '38, the first elements of the prototype began to be assembled in the factories. The metal was cut with almost religious precision. Every bolt, every panel was like a brushstroke in the portrait of the plane that was to become the pride of Germany. In the drafting halls, they whispered that if it all worked, this machine would fly over half the planet, and the whole world would know the name of its creator. But, for now, it was just a plan, a brilliant idea drawn in pencil on paper. It awaited its moment when reality would lift it into the sky, and no one yet knew that the fate of this machine would be no less paradoxical than the country that gave it birth. War burst into the plans like a storm, sweeping everything away. What had recently seemed like a great mission, a flight for the Olympic flame, suddenly became a ridiculous dream. In '37, Japan began the war with China, and the flame that was supposed to symbolize the friendship of nations turned into the smoke of burned cities. The Olympic spirit gave way to the march of soldiers' boots. And when Germany crossed the Polish border in '39, the illusion of the world stage completely shattered. The world they wanted to show the record flight to was now burning for real. The games were canceled, and the word peace sounded almost mocking. The idea for which the aircraft was created lost its meaning, and the Adolphine was left an orphan among new military projects. It was replaced by heavy bombers, ground attack planes, and fighters, those that could genuinely influence the course of events. The Me-261 project fell out of priority. In the factories, metal and engines went to the front. Blueprints gathered dust in folders. Designers received different assignments. The plane that was supposed to connect Berlin and Tokyo as a symbol of friendship now looked like an artifact from another time. Too complex, too peaceful, too useless. Work almost stopped. Lights went out in the laboratories and engineers went home, unsure if they would ever return to this machine. But even in the shadow of war, the idea of long-distance flight continued to attract military strategists. Some saw a chance for reconnaissance. A plane capable of flying thousands of kilometers without refueling could peer where the enemy considered themselves safe. Others dreamed of using it for long-range communication flights, delivering couriers, or even dropping propaganda materials over enemy territory. The staff discussed, what if we converted the Adolphine from an Olympic symbol into a reconnaissance tool? After all, it could fly half the globe, observing the enemy without engaging in combat. Not as a warrior, but as a shadow. And although no official orders were issued, the engineers who believed in their brainchild continued to work in their free hours. They knew the war changed everything, but they couldn't allow their work to vanish as if it had never been. By early '40, the blueprints reappeared on the desks. New notes appeared on the old sheets, not about records, but about observation, cameras, and enlarged fuel tanks. The peaceful aircraft began to be molded into a tool of war. The idea of propaganda gave way to military necessity. Thus, a new meaning was born for the machine that was once supposed to carry the fire of peace. Now, that fire was replaced by another flame, in which the whole continent was melting. A cold morning in December 1940. After months of inaction and doubt, after dozens of changes to the blueprints and arguments about the project's fate, the giant born of propaganda finally took to the air. Its gray fuselage, sleek and elongated like an arrow, lifted off the concrete runway and smoothly ascended into the sky. People on the ground froze. In that moment, a hope was born that it hadn't all been for nothing. The Me-261 was no longer just a blueprint or a symbol of ambition. It was a living, real airplane. The first prototype, designated V1, took off to the roar of 4 engines, paired into 2 powerful blocks. It climbed steadily, smoothly, as if created not to fight the wind, but to tame it. For the first time, the engineers saw not lines on paper, but the embodiment of their nocturnal calculations and risky decisions. The results of the first flight stunned even the skeptics. tests showed a range that other designers could only dream of, over 12,000 kilometers. The number sounded almost fantastic, half the planet beneath the wing of a single machine. From Berlin, one could fly to New York without landing. One could scout the Arctic or cross all of Eurasia. For the first time, the Germans gained the ability to view the war as a global map, where there were no longer any unreachable points. But this success was Janus-faced. The plane flew far, but it couldn't fight. Without armament, without armor, it was defenseless against any attack. The Adolphine could see the enemy, but couldn't defend itself. The military considered this a weakness, the engineers a special feature. They proposed a new use, not to fight, but to intimidate. Thus, the strange idea was born to use the plane to drop leaflets over enemy cities. The paradox was that the machine created as a symbol of propaganda was once again transformed into its tool. Only now, literally. No bombs fell from its hatches, but words, promises, threats, appeals. In the sky above, the enemy flew not a fighter, but an emissary of ideas. And although this seemed absurd against the backdrop of destruction, inside Germany, the design seemed poetic. The plane that was supposed to carry the Olympic flame was now carrying another burning stream of convictions. Every new flight became a test, not only for the technology, but also for the faith in the project itself. The people in the workshops already knew that the Adolphine wouldn't change the course of the war, but they continued to assemble parts, check rivets, and lubricate engines. Perhaps they were driven by stubbornness, an unwillingness to admit that it had all been in vain. Sometimes, when the plane returned from tests, the mechanics stood by the runway, listening as the roar of its engines subsided. This sound was special. It resembled not a military march, but the breath of a being created in defiance of everything. And each time its wheels touched the ground, it felt as though the very idea of the unbroken engineering spirit was still alive. The Me-261 was no longer a toy for parades. It became a symbol of persistence, a machine that survived amidst war to prove that even in chaos, one can soar above propaganda for the sheer possibility of flight. Spring 1943. Clouds gather over Germany, not metaphorical ones, but real, black ones, soaked in the soot of war. Factories work around the clock, fronts burn from Eastern Europe to Africa, and everything not directly related to combat seems like a useless luxury. But somewhere in the shadows of military reports, amidst casualty and victory accounts, the quiet work continues. On the airfield near Augsburg, Messerschmitt engineers are preparing the third prototype, the Me-261 V3, for takeoff. This version differed from its predecessors. Beneath the skin were new engines, combined into more reliable pairs, slightly increased power, improved aerodynamics. It could climb higher, fly more stably, and stay in the air longer. And although no one expected miracles anymore, a hope flickered in everyone standing by the runway. Perhaps this very flight would give meaning to all the years spent. When the plane lifted off the ground, the sound of its engines was not like the thunder of combat machines. It was a steady, confident drone, like the pulse of a living organism that hadn't surrendered despite everything. In the air, it held steady hour after hour, without slowing down. 10 hours of continuous flight, almost 3,000 miles without refueling, without stopping. Figures that would impress any aviation magazine in the world, if the world had time to read magazines then. Test records showed fantastic results. The machine proved Germany was able to create an aircraft capable of flying almost half the globe. But the war shifted priorities. Records became useless when cities were collapsing and fuel was going to the front. No cameras were set up, no press was gathered, no grandstands were built. The plane took off, set a record, and landed in silence. No ovations, no protocols, no notes in the newspapers, only tired engineers looking at it like a ghost from the past. In those years, even miracles lost their meaning. The world was busy surviving, and there was simply no room left for admiring engineering. The Adolphine flew over a country that was already beginning to crack from within. Its success remained in the shadows, like the shadow of a huge wing gliding across the ground where columns of soldiers marched. And yet, there was something symbolic in that flight. The plane, born for glory, was now flying without spectators, without purpose, without applause, only for the sake of the flight itself. It became a reflection of the country that once dreamed of conquering the whole world and was now just trying not to fall. Every hour spent in the sky was a silent reminder. Greatness built on vanity always loses its meaning when there is no one left to applaud it. When the Me-261 returned to Earth, the pilots emerged from the cockpit without smiles. They knew they had just set a record, but hardly anyone would ever know about it. The machine was taxied into the hangar, and the doors slowly closed. In that sound, the scraping of metal shutting out the light, it was as if the final chord of a story that no one ever heard had been struck. Summer, 1944. The war reached its climax. The skies, once belonging to Germany, were now burning under the strikes of Allied aviation. City after city turned into ash, and airfields were no longer places of pride, but merely targets. On one of them in Bavaria stood 3 airplanes born for a different time. They were called by different names, V1, V2, and V3. But to those who built them, they were still the Adolphines, machines in which the belief once lived that metal could become a symbol of greatness. The first perished first. During a raid on the factory near Augsburg, bombs fell directly on the hangar. A crumpled fuselage, broken wings, ruptured fuel tanks. All that remained of the plane that was supposed to connect continents. A few weeks later, the same fate befell the second. Flames devoured the metal, and only soot remained of its former shine. Only one remained, the third, the last. It survived its sisters, but its fate was also precarious. During landing in one of the tests, the landing gear strut buckled. The plane crashed onto its side, and the damage was serious. It was repaired for a long time, pieced back together, as if they were trying to revive the memory of a time when Germany still believed in miracles. And yet, after repairs, the Adolphine took to the air again, like a spirit unwilling to accept oblivion. What happened next is not exactly known. Some documents hint that it was used for long-range reconnaissance flights, others, that it simply stood in the hangar while dust settled on it. Perhaps it took off a few more times, crossed the Baltic, or flew over the Eastern Front, observing the flames of war. Or maybe it just quietly rusted while Germany crumbled under its own ambitions. Thus concluded the story of the plane that was created for eternity, but lived only a few years. It didn't become a legend, didn't change the course of the war, and didn't enter textbooks. Its name vanished from reports like thousands of other projects that began with enthusiasm and ended in smoke. But it is in this disappearance that the era is reflected. An era in which dreams of greatness turned to dust, where every record dissolved in the sound of sirens and explosions. And strangely enough, the Adolphine's failure became a symbol of what the country itself endured. The aircraft, named after the dictator, repeated his fate, born of ambition, lived for glory, and ended in dust. It was the embodiment of an era where everything was measured in records, numbers, and impressions, not in humanity. And yet, despite the oblivion, the Me-261 left its mark not on a map, but in the understanding of what the cult of propaganda leads to. The machine, created for beauty and pride, served as a reminder that even the loudest symbols lose meaning when the fuel of vanity runs out. The Adolphine was once supposed to carry the fire of peace, then the words of war, and in the end, it was only a shadow. And if one listens closely, it seems that somewhere in the sky, its drone still sounds, an echo of the era when Germany tried to convince the world of its greatness and ultimately drowned in its own echo.